about Hobbes at the end. Towards the end of your comments on Hobbes, you said that there were these two parts of his book, parts 2 and part 3, and that in the first part, in part 2, he thought that you first tried to give approximate definitions, and then in the third part, you say he talks about geometry, right. And then you went on to refer to him as explaining in terms of eternal truths. Yeah. And my question is, I thought of Hobbes as a kind of nominalist who didn't perhaps believe in real definitions. And so when you talked about approximate definitions, then I began to wonder in what sense these are eternal truths as opposed to conventions.
They're not approximate, they are proximate. Not approximate, but proximate.
Which means?
To the definitions. And what he means is you begin with definitions, and then there are the proximate truths that follow from them, which is to say those that follow directly from the definitions. Uh-huh. And then there are the more distant truths.
And what is the status of the definitions? I mean,
that's a real problem in Hobbes, because on the one hand, he does say you can define things any way you like.
Right.
You know, on the other hand, when you actually look at the way in which he works, they are not arbitrary, and I think that that's one of the real puzzles in understanding what it is that Hobbes is up to, and I'm afraid I don't really, have an answer to that. How it is that you can get a substantive science out of definitions that are basically at will.
So it seemed as if there might be a difference between him and Spinoza, because with Spinoza you think, well, there's nature, whether you call it God right. or nature, there's some metaphysical ground for these eternal truths or necessary truths, right? But with Hobbes, you might think it's conventional in some sense.
I think in practice, I think he wants it to be more than conventional. I mean, Hobbes certainly believes that there is a nature out there. I mean, there's no question about it. But what he says about, I think the puzzling thing is the doctrine of definitions as being arbitrary. He does say that, and I don't think anybody's explained really how it is that you can put that together with the actual physics that follows out of that.
My questions are about Spinoza, and I'd like to float a couple of thoughts about Spinoza by you to see how they connect or don't connect with what you're suggesting. I take it that the majority of 17th century thinkers on the subject of laws of nature, physical laws of nature, assumed that in order for them to have any explanatory force as laws, they would have to be grounded in a powerful voluntary agent.
Or at least a powerful agent.
A powerful agent. Yeah. I take it the majority thought it would be voluntary.
Probably, yeah.
And Spinoza strikes me as the most obvious example of someone that we might think of as, in the century, that we might think of as having articulated a conception in which the laws of nature, including physical laws, are necessary truths. I mean, a sort of precursor of David Armstrong, freestanding, independent, necessary truths. Not an idea, frankly, that I have ever thought particularly plausible, but it's an interesting idea. Yeah. And but I have a couple of questions about it, how you might see it. One is, one model that suggests itself is Spinoza thought that the whole universe is a thinking and extended substance, yeah. And the laws of nature are, as it were, the principles constituting and or flowing from the Aristotelian essence of that one substance. That would be one way to think of it. But there's also, I mean, so I'd be interested in your reaction to that one. But another thing is this. If I look in the structure of the ethics for where does the necessity come from, the most obvious place to look is in Proposition 16 of Part 1 of the Ethics, that from what Spinoza thinks he's proved to that point, it follows that everything, infinite things in infinite modes, that is everything that can possibly exist, flows from the divine nature. From the divine nature.
Right.
Now, that's to say that actuality and possibility are coextensive.
Yes.
And that can either be a narrowing of possibility or an enlargement of actuality. And while I'm pretty sure that Spinoza thought he was narrowing possibility, it's hard to see an argument up to that point in the ethics for why what he's saying there wouldn't be verified by a universe substance as bountiful as David Lewis's pluriverse. And of course, if that's the picture, then the picture thus far gives us not the slightest reason to assume in advance that we're living in what will continue to be an orderly part of the universe, since in David Lewis's pluriverse there are extremely disorderly parts of it, and some of them, and parts that turn orderly and turn disorderly, and so forth. So, I don't know. Do you have reactions to either of those thoughts?
That's an interesting idea. I do think that in a certain sense, Spinoza would be perfectly happy with living in a kind of Lewisian pluriverse. That's to say, all of what we might think of as other possible worlds actually exist in the same way that this one does, except maybe not in such a way that they are causally accessible to us. That would be, I think, probably okay. It's what follows from the divine nature might be something like that. However, I think that he would say, and here actually Descartes would say the same thing, but for a different reason, that they would all obey the same laws, which comes back to, in a certain way, your first question, which is the relationship between the nature of God and these laws. Remember, the nature of God, one of the divine attributes, and one can understand the full divine essence through each of the attributes individually. One of the divine attributes is, of course, extension. And I think that he would say that the laws of geometry, taken broadly, in roughly the kind of Hobbesian way I think he had in mind, are things that are necessarily true of necessarily follow from the attribute of extension. So insofar as you recognized a David Lewisian pluriverse, they would still all be, modes of the infinite substance, one of whose attributes was extension, and would thus be constrained by the same laws of motion and rest as we see in this universe. So even though there may be other sort of what we may think of as possible worlds, they're not going to be able to vary in terms of the laws of nature.
Which I suppose brings the question back to the question of whether Spinoza really has any good reasons for thinking that this set of laws of motion follows from the nature of extension.
Right. No, absolutely. I think here he is following out, excuse me. That was not Spinoza calling, I think, to explain himself. Where were we? Why we think? I think that he was not a physicist. On the other hand, I do think that he was impressed by Hobbes's physics, and that he takes himself to be following Hobbes in this respect.
Okay, we have 5 people lined up, 6 now. So James first.
So I wanted to ask you a question about Leibniz. This quotation that you have from Leibniz's Dynamica on page 2, it looks like Leibniz is saying that the principle of the equality of cause and effect is a law of nature. And I was a little bit surprised to see that for 2 reasons. First, the principle of the equality of cause and effect looks like a kind of metaphysical principle.
Yeah.
Very different from the other sorts of things that he seems to hold to be laws of nature, conservation of vis viva, conservation of respective speed, conservation of momentum. It seems like it's a general metaphysical principle. It seems different from the other laws of nature. And then 2, I know that at least in certain points of his career, he thinks that the principle of the equality of cause and effect holds with geometrical necessity. It's a kind of Hobbesian truth, eternal truth. So why then, I guess I have 2 questions. So why then does he think of it, why is he calling it a law of nature here? And 2, if he does think that it holds with geometrical necessity, like Hobbes and Spinoza, how is his conception of laws of nature really different from theirs at the end of the day?
Okay. On the first question, let me do the second question first. The quality of cause and effect was discovered in the summer of 1676. And it was a real big deal, and Leibniz knew that, and he had been sort of doing Hobbesian physics before that, came upon this and realized that, boy, this is a really important discovery. Earlier, he had agreed with Hobbes that laws of nature are basically geometrical and universal. When he discovered this, he made the assumption that it too was geometrical and that necessary, and you could prove it. And in the first articulations of it, explicitly says that. By the end of the decade, though, he changed his mind. And then, you know, by the time you get to, well, I mean, in that famous letter to Roman that I quote on the 3rd page, it's now, you know, the paradigm example, in fact, of a contingent principle. So that's just change of mind in Leibniz. On the question, is it really a law of nature or is it a metaphysical principle? Well, it's really both. It is, in the end, I think he considers what, you know, at least through a great deal of the period, well, when we're dealing with a physical world. Question, are there monads underneath? I think that they come in later, but nevertheless, at some point, they certainly do come in. But still, physics has a kind of autonomy. Within the physical world, what's basic is force, and what's sort of and extension and motion are grounded in force. So the principle of equality of cause and effect is, you can consider it a metaphysical principle, or you can consider it a physical principle. You know, the distinction between the two is not that sharp, I think. But it is a basic principle that governs force as such. And a consequence of it is the conservation of mv squared, which is a kind of derived, or conservation of momentum, or respective speed. Those are derivative notions.
Thank you.
Yeah, pass the microphone across there.
So my question is, how close Hobbes and Spinoza really are on the question of laws. So, I mean, I think it's right that to say that laws of nature are eternal truths, not grounded on a transcendent God for either one of them. That seems right. But how close are they really on other matters? So you're showing us what looks like a law in Hobbes that's derived from the principle of sufficient reason, and that
Yeah.
does seem to be the way that he's deriving it.
Yeah.
And then you show us what looks like a law